Now for our lesson on feminism. Got some kind of a spot here on my face, but unfortunately my makeup crew is not available at the moment, so just gonna have to live with it. Let's start with moving towards a definition of feminism. And I'll start with a loose definition. You could I would describe it as a movement primarily led by women, but not exclusively, promoting women's rights and women's participation in the political process. Um, that that is a true statement that generally covers the bases, but of course there's much more to it. Just start with that as a point of orientation. Um, I think we should make an important distinction here at the outset between what I would call reform feminism, which simply seeks ways to improve the lives of women, and ideological feminism, which involves a systematic philosophical or ideological framework. For example, about you know, the about male and female nature, institutions like marriage and how they fit into, the larger scheme and so forth, worked out systematically. That's the ideological version. So of the former, although she contributes to, the, an ideological understanding. Jane Addams is an example of someone who's primarily concerned with just improving women's lives. Um, your reading talked about, the situation of women in urban tenement buildings and how you know how you know they need various social services to enable them to provide for their children and so forth. Um, I would classify that as reform feminism. In the latter category, you could speak of Mary Wollstonecraft back in the 18th century, because she provides sort of puts the rights of women within the the theory of natural rights, and then more recently, Simone de Beauvoir, author of The Second Sex in 1949, um, which is with her moving towards a more radical feminism. Um, what ideological category should we put feminism in? Well, I think it fits with Michael Friedman's uh, Frieden's Michael Frieden, his category of micro ideology, in that it is not trying to provide a systematic political theory, but focuses systematically on one particular segment of social and political life. Um, though it typically does think of sex or gender as profoundly impacting every area of life. Um, I think it helps to uh, initially look at feminism on a kind of spectrum, corresponding to their views specifically of domestic life. So, on the relatively conservative end, um, you have feminists who understand marriage, motherhood, and family life to be high or even the highest priority for women, though insisting that women need to be educated and politically engaged, right? Um, and then across the other end of the spectrum, radical feminism, which sees marriage as inherently patriarchal and oppressive uh, as an institution and seeks a radical transformation of the social order, overthrowing perceived patriarchal power structures deemed to be pervasive in society. So there's a good range between those two feminist perspectives. Within the first category, I think early liberals like Mary Wollstonecraft and Jane Addams. Jane Addams is later, but still early in the uh, general scheme of feminism. And a rather more conservative Jane Austen. You could classify them all as feminists, but they're kind of more of the reform variety. You have right-leaning uh, feminists. Uh, they tend to be right in the libertarian sense. Um, Feminist critics of leftist feminism, like Tammy Bruce and Christine Hoff Summers, um, and you have maybe a functional equivalent of of this brand of feminism in the American Republican Party. I mean, conservative women who are very politically engaged and really have the basic outlook of this first class, even if they don't describe themselves as feminists. So women like Nikki Haley, for example. Um, Within the second category, I've mentioned Simone de, de Beauvoir earlier, and she is certainly in that category, seeing marriage as inherently problematic, kind of speaking more in terms of uh, a pervasive patriarchal structure of society. And then at the farthest extreme, you could mention Valerie Solanas, a so-called lesbian misandrist. Misandrist is a hater of men and boys, who wrote the probably satirical Scum Manifesto, identifying men as the source of the world's problems and calling for overthrowing society and even eliminating the male sex. I hope that part is satirical. At least men like me hope that. And she's also notable for shooting Andy Warhol and Mario Amaya, an African American art critic. I mean, African American who criticizes art, not specializing in African American art per se. Uh, they were together. She walked into their office and shot him. This is extreme. This is not typical. But there are among some radical feminist a uh, kind of animus towards men. Um, so that's the farthest extreme. And in between, you have there's a lot of feminists who would fit in between. Um, Mostly on the left, uh, left of center, uh, but from left to farther left, you could talk of Margaret Sanger, who's the founder of Planned Parenthood. Initially, by the way, not in favor of abortion, but I guess later in life leaned that way. And of course, Planned Parenthood is in the public mind heavily associated with abortion. Um, and then a little further to the left, you have Betty Friedan, who is the author of the very influential book, The Feminist Mystique, The Feminine Mystique, uh, which was based on interviews with a lot of women talking about their dissatisfaction with their lives as homemakers, housewives, whatever, and they're wanting more out of life and so forth. And Betty Friedan founded the organization, the National Organization for Women, or NOW. Now expressing the urgency of change and so forth. Um, the history of feminism in the United States has been uh, described in terms of having four waves. Um, Not all feminists, some feminists would quibble with the sort of waves categorization. They would say it's too complex for that, but it's useful for analytical purposes in parsing out the different sort of forms feminism has taken. So, working here from an article by one Martha Rampton called "The Four Waves of Feminism," which seemed to capture things pretty well. So I want to quote from her uh, a bit here. But the first wave um, is the comes in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and it was focused on suffrage. I mean, the vote, right, and generally opening more opportunities for women. Um, it was closely associated with other reform movements. I mean, the abolition movement, for example, and the temperance movement, uh, and resulting in the, uh, from some perspectives, unfortunate Prohibition Amendment, which of course was repealed later on. Um, but interestingly, by the way, the temperance movement had a lot to do with domestic abuse. I mean, there was a lot of people um, saw, a sort of real social problem in terms of there were a lot of men, spending, huge amounts of their time in the saloons, and then there was a problem uh, apparently with some men beating their wives, in a drunken stupor and this kind of thing. And so, there was some, real legitimate causes of, beyond just a sort of some kind of puritanical, opposition to drinking per se. Um, but in any case, so there was a very reform minded thrust here, right? Um, Typical of this was the Seneca Falls, New York Declaration of Sentiments, is what it's usually called, written primarily by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, um, and patterned on the Declaration of Independence, very close. It's structured, it's worded very similarly to the Declaration of Independence. The story there is interesting. Behind that, I mean, Elizabeth Cady Stanton uh, and some other women had gone to an abolitionist rally, but they were kept out because it was men only. Sort of ironic situation, and so they went off and did their own thing. But one of the things they did was this convention of women in Seneca Falls, New York, and they wrote up this Declaration of Sentiments and signed it and so forth. Let's talk a little bit more about that later. So that's the first wave. The second wave, roughly from the 1960s to the 1990s, and this was more focused on sexuality and reproductive rights, um, uh, notably including abortion or right to abortion. Um, and of course, the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision in 1973 was a landmark event in relation to this. But this group of feminists were associated with the New Left, the so-called New Left, which was a little more culturally oriented than the Old Left, which was just focused on economic issues primarily. Um, and they tended to this wave, uh, feminists in this wave tended to reject conventions of modesty, for example, not wearing bras and stuff like that, and male-defined ideas of sexiness. Um, so desexified in the male version of it, oftentimes, no makeup, more less revealing clothes, perhaps. Tension there with the modesty thing, um, but that was one characteristic of feminists in that phase. One of their big projects was advocating the Equal Rights Amendment, an proposed amendment to the Constitution, um, and the story there is interesting too. I mean, it was not passed, as you may know, um, and the opposition to it was led by women, um, most notably a woman named Phyllis Schlafly. And the reason for their opposition, these were conservative women, and the reason for their opposition was that they thought the Equal Rights Amendment was intended to be, as perhaps it was, and would in fact become a vehicle for pushing through a leftist agenda, um, including things related to uh, abortion and other social reforms. Remember these the harder left wing of feminist, talked about wanting to transform society in in some comprehensive way. And anyway, these are the kind of things that these conservative women thought this was the intention, and they argued that the women all everything that was necessary to establish uh, equal rights and fairness for women was already built into the Constitution. There was no need for this. Anyway, um, to quote this article I mentioned, um, there's a nice account here of the theory developing in this second wave, um, and she says it was based on a fusion of neo-Marxism, so the more cultural variety of Marxism I've mentioned a couple of times, extending sort of the Marxist oppression narratives, if you will, from class to also including race and sex. Um, and initially, sex meant basically feminism, or rights of women. This category sort of gets broadened more loosely into gender, and LGBT rights and so forth. But a fusion of neo-Marxism and psychoanalytical theories, psychoanalytical theory coming from Freud initially, and which of course Freud understood the sex drive as sort of fundamentally formative of the whole personality, and a primary shaper of society itself. Um, and uh, and they began to associate the subjection of women, I'm quoting again, with broader critiques of patriarchy, capitalism, normative heterosexuality, meaning the norm that sex should be between men and women, um, and the woman's role as wife and mother. Um, so they're critiquing these um, these traditional categories in a broader way, right? And here you see connections with other ideologies, um, and then sex and gender were differentiated. The former being biological, right? What biological sex are you? And then but gender being a social construct that varies from culture to culture and over time, right? And the social construct was more fluid. Uh, contained cultural ideas about sex roles, the role of women in society and in the household and so forth. Um, and the point was that these things are not based in nature necessarily. In fact, they would deny that, but that they're productions of whatever culture, and therefore not to be taken uh, too seriously. Uh, so and this women in this second wave coined the term identity politics, which I sometimes use in relation to this these neo-Marxist categories of of disadvantaged or oppressed classes, um, classes of people. I mean, not economic classes. And there was a movement here towards what came to be known as intersectionality, meaning a person is an intersection of different identities, and they're conceiving this identity in kind of cultural Marxist categories. So you could be a member of several oppressed groups, right? And so there are layers of oppression that could affect you. So that say if you were a black female lesbian, uh, you know, you're checking off several boxes of oppressed groups. Um, the third wave was somewhat critical of the second wave. Third wave began in the mid 1990s, and it was informed by post-colonial and postmodern thinking. Post-colonial deals with sort of critiques of Western categories and so forth that were seen to be imposed by the period of Western imperialism in the 19th and first half of the 20th century, um, and postmodernism being a philosophical approach, thinking that modern Enlightenment categories were problematic. They were essentializing. Sometimes I use the word. The, the categories were too tight. Uh, you know, uh, essentialize. You define something in terms of one specific characteristic or something like that, and it's more complicated than that. And generally a critique of the idea of truth, that there are objective standards for understanding the world. This is closely associated with the so-called linguistic turn in philosophy, where really all of our understanding of life is mediated through language, and we can't really escape uh, language structures our thinking, and there's no sort of real contact with reality such that we could say this is objectively true. Uh, it's all reality, at least in relation to us, is a construct. And in this phase, feminists were, I'll quote because this is helpful. So, in this phase, many constructs were destabilized. You see a lot of buzzwords like this in the academic literature. Destabilized means questioned, critiqued, including notions of universal womanhood, body, gender, sexuality, and heteronormativity. So universal womanhood is the idea that there's a universal standard of womanhood. Um, that there is a fixed nature for women, or something like that. And even our ideas about the body uh, are, are constructs, right? So the point is that these ideas we have about all these things are not determined by nature, because there is no true nature of anything that we could recognize, uh, and, uh, and so there's no true nature of womanhood, sexuality, or in fact of anything human, right? It's all socially constructed. Um, and these women in this third wave uh, here's the criticism of the second wave. They tended to see the second wave feminists as um, excuse me, as sort of seeing themselves as victims, um, and we kind of goes along with the oppression narrative idea that women have always been victimized, and they continue to be victimized. And the problem with this, pointed out by the third wave theorist, is this can be disempowering. This can work against your ability to develop yourself. And so they you know presented an image of women as strong and empowered, and they wanted to empower women to develop their potential and so forth. And they wanted to kind of bring back, although under their own terms, kind of sexy idea of women. They they brought back sexiness. Uh, you know, Instead of trying to what's the term? De-emphasize your looks. Not wear makeup, etc., etc. This wave of wanted to celebrate uh, female beauty and so forth. The kind of leading figure here was a woman named Naomi Wolf. You still see her showing up now and then on TV. Um, who did wear makeup and and high heels and all this stuff. Is uh, I don't know if it's high heels, but it's a kind of example of bringing back sexiness as a positive thing, right? Of course, critics saw them as simply restoring male-defined ideas about sexiness, but that's not the way they saw it. Um, and, uh, and people in this phase tended to celebrate uh, the activity of sex and the uh, you know um, they celebrated relationships with men as much as as much as traditional women, as well as being open to lesbianism and so forth. The fourth wave, um, if you, I guess it's somewhat controversial whether you should speak of a fourth wave, but beginning of the last decade, um, some people would say that there was a new wave of feminism, or there is a new wave developing of feminism that wants to restore elements of the second wave, but build on both the second and the third waves, and it focuses on problems, a host of social problems. And this will all seem familiar to you because you see it in the news a lot. Um, Focus on problems like sexual abuse, rape, violence against women, unequal pay, slut shaming, the pressure on women to conform to a single and unrealistic body type, and the realization that gains in female representation in politics and business, for example, are very slight. Uh, in other words, they think there hasn't been that much progress. So this is kind of there's kind of you can see if you read through that list, sort of a hodgepodge of different concerns of the second and the third wave, um, and uh, and recent examples. Recently, Title IX protections, Title IX of the Civil Rights Act, which focuses on women's rights, Title IX protections against sexual harassment, and response to allegations of rape on college campuses. This is very aggressively pushed by the Obama administration to the point where there have been concerns about violating the due process of men who were accused. But that's in the recent news. And then there's the so-called Me Too movement, right? Um, in relation to the somewhat circus-like uh, hearings on Brett Kavanaugh when he's appointed to the Supreme Court. And I mean, the Me Too movement is a bunch of women going public with stories about prior sexual abuse, and sort of seen as a solidarity moment and a moment of sort of awakening people to continuing problems for women. And and this was, by the way, it was not only on the left that this was appreciated. There were some people on the right who thought that even though they felt like Kavanaugh was being railroaded, there were women on the right who thought that this is a good thing that we're focusing on the dangers of maybe of the sexual revolution, some unintended consequences, and so forth. We'll touch on that later. There are a lot of internal controversies within feminism, as I've already hinted at. And let me just kind of go through some of them. I think it will bring out a lot of the nuances. I'm gonna kind of do this maybe not in quite the same um, intellectual categories language that feminists might use, but in a way I think it really gets to the deeper philosophical issues. So The first controversy you could say is about nature. Um, is there a distinctly feminine nature such that one might speak of distinctive feminist virtues that uniquely contribute to the well being of society? Some women think that thinking that way uh, is sort of a product of patriarchy. Um, Other women think that well, this is very important to the the cause of women to say that they do have a certain natural qualities that make them that give them make them uniquely suited to contribute certain important things to society. Um, and here you could compare Mary Wollstonecraft to the second and third wave feminists. Um, yeah, the the third wave feminists want to emphasize more feminine virtues, things that are unique to women, things that men can't contribute. And and this goes along with the argument that men are the source of a lot of the world's problems, or most of the world's problems, or what have you. Um, and But Wollstonecraft, and this is true of Jane Addams too, to some degree. I mean, they talked about the importance of feminist virtues for life in the home, for the health of the family, and also for um, developing social, moral character that you know and the home is the incubator for virtue, but also that through their own unique feminine virtues, uh, they can make society better, right? A second controversy is over the question of rights, um, and this really goes specifically to the question of the basis of rights. Okay, so you're talking about women's rights. Um, for your argument to be compelling, it might be helpful to say, what is the basis of your rights claims? And um, the first wave, they put it in terms of natural rights, God-given rights, the kind of rights mentioned in the Declaration of Independence. And this is what like Wollstonecraft did that. So there is an objective, higher um, standard to appeal to in claiming women's rights. But then you have these others, the third wave presumably sees rights as constructed, like everything's constructed uh, in this uh, in this postmodern perspective. Um, and that's raises the problem. I mean, if rights are constructed, what is the standard by which to critique uh, the constructions? I mean, what is the standard by which to demand justice? Um, and I mean, this is a problem that, as far as I can tell, feminists, at least feminists on the left, have not addressed. So um, I'll return to that question later. Then um, uh, women in their relation to men. There's differences here too, and I think most fundamentally you could put difference in terms of equality versus difference. So, I mean, first of all, there's the question of equal to men in what respect? Equal in every respect, uh, under law, legal equalities, economic equalities, social equalities. Um, do you want to live exactly the same way as men, uh, or what kind of equality are you talking about? And there are some incompatible attitudes, or they seem incompatible, um, between some of the feminists. So, uh, you know, uh, generally both want to have access, both sides of this want to have access to traditional male roles and careers, but women in the second wave, feminists in the second wave, uh, were inclined to adopt male attitudes and qualities associated with traditional male uh, attitudes and qualities and sexual habits as well. Um, Men were sort of famous for being promiscuous, but women were supposed to be pure, you know, and then but then they wanted greater freedom to be promiscuous uh, too. And I mean, critics so indecorously, probably these weren't feminists, but some of them indecorously referred to this as penis envy. Um, then there were others who wanted to emphasize and celebrate differences, right, and women's unique contributions to society, um, and criticizing the masculine way of doing things, right. Um, and seeing men as bad actors, not merely in denying women's rights, but in their basic approach to life. Um, so which is it? Equality to men in the sense of sameness, or is equality in a different sense? And is are the differences to be celebrated or condemned? And which differences are to be celebrated, et cetera, right? Then in this category of relation to men, also the question of sexuality. There's some differences. Um, First, on the question of sexual norms, right? I mean, feminists on the right would say that there are natural norms, um, for example, about motherhood, uh, heterosexuality, and so forth. Uh, are there natural norms of some kind in terms of sexual behavior? Uh, this is not really taken seriously by women on the left, but I suppose it's a question legitimate to ask. Um, are there salutary traditional norms? For example, the institution of marriage, modesty. Are these healthy norms? Um, do you want to be better than men in terms of, for example, being more virtuous, as Wollstonecraft spoke of, or or do you want to be free to be as bad, if you will? Is slut a legitimate shame category, or is it something? Is in the third wave they embraced, right? They like to appropriate those negative terms and adopt them. Then the sexual revolution, um, free love, if you will, right? So in the 60s, uh, just an idea that, uh, well, traditionally, sex outside of marriage is bad. Sexual revolution, it's good, it's fine, um, and, uh, and so on. Um, but the question has arisen: are there costs as well as benefits to that revolution? Um, I mean, has it, for example, diminished male commitment to relationship and their sense of responsibility to women? I mean, an argument could be made that the benefits accrue more to men than to women. Men are getting what they always wanted. Uh, you know, Free, irresponsible sex, not having to worry about the consequences. Uh, which marriage was has been historically meant to be part of the purpose was to restrain men in their tendency to be promiscuous, um, and to solidify their commitment to their spouse and their family, right? Um, then one of the most interesting ones is on pornography and prostitution. You have one group of feminists seeing pornography and even prostitution as a kind of liberating free expression. Um, and then you have another, which is a little more traditional, uh, who say that it is degrading and enslaving, both pornography and prostitution. This is an interesting area of sort of strange bedfellows politically. Some like evangelical Christians, who think pornography should be regulated or banned, right? Um, and feminists, these feminists on this side of the question, uh, you know, make common cause with them. And so, uh, and a very interesting example of this is between of this differences between Camille Paglia, Paglia, and Catherine McKinnon, who is on the radical feminist wing. McKinnon is opposed to pornography and prostitution as degrading and enslaving to women, and Paglia thinks that it's a great avenue of free expression. Um, and this well, uh, this corresponds to some degree with the tendency to want to call people who have traditionally been called prostitutes sex workers. It's a trade that they've chosen, and that kind of thing. Polly is interesting also in that she is often highly critical of trends in feminism, and she has friendly relationships with people on the libertarian right, or libertarian is one of those uh, hard to classify categories. Uh, but if you're a libertarian, if you're a full spectrum libertarian, and you think that not only in economic affairs but also in social affairs that that society shouldn't try to regulate things, then libertarians would be more simpatico with the left, thinking, well, these things. Pornography is just a private pursuit of happiness, that no one has any business, criticizing or trying to regulate. And then there's abortion, and here I don't even know if it's proper to call it a debate. It doesn't seem to be much debate about it on the left, although there are women on the left who are opposed to abortion. But it's primarily between feminists on the right versus left feminists. Um, and it boils down to really a clash of rights claims. So uh, the 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 right to abortion uh, group puts it in terms of a right to choose. Right, it's a matter of freedom for the woman, and the ability to control when and whether you get pregnant is crucial to uh, women's independence and being able to control their lives. Um, Versus a right to life is what the people on the other side say, that there is a right of the child in the womb, right to to life, and that trumps the woman's freedom in this particular area. And then you also have, this may extend beyond just right versus left, but it's still mainly between right and left. Whether there should be any restrictions on abortion, that whether it should be only in extremis, typically categories people mention are, in case of rape, incest, or to save the life of the mother, or is it sort of whole hog abortion for any reason, for convenience. As I heard one woman put it rather crassly, abortion is important for my freedom to, I won't say it, it's the F word, um, without having to worry about consequences. So, um, so reasonable women can disagree about these things. Um, and then finally, a, another controversy. This is very recent. Is on the question of gender fluidity. I mean, you have this recent movement of transgenderism, um, and a lot of feminists have seen this transgender movement as a threat to feminism. I mean, um, traditionally, at least, feminism presupposes a fundamental um, difference between men and women on some level, and at least certainly these women who want to think of being a woman as something special and distinctive and enabling them to make a special contribution. This is undermined by transgenderism by making sex an ambiguous category and so forth. And you have a lot of feminists, really worried about and criticizing this transgender movement. The most spectacular sort of outcome of this has been uh, men who identify as women engaging in women's sports. You've seen some of this around the country, and these biological males winning contests, because they're stronger and bigger and so forth. Um, and this strikes a lot of feminists as sort of denying the kind of rights that they fought for. This is systematically disadvantaging to women. Um, and similarly about sharing bathrooms and so forth. There was this movement still going on, suggesting that there should be no separate restrooms for men and women, or that anyone who identifies as uh, male or female can go to whichever restroom they identify with. And some feminists think, well, this is sort of a recipe for rape and sexual assault, to have men uh, identifying themselves as women going into women's restrooms. In fact, there have been cases of this, uh, because, of course, it's hard to tell when a person is self-identifying as something, uh, how much they mean it. In any case, feminism is not just one block thing. There's a lot of um, disagreements and nuances within it. Okay, um, now for some thoughts on. I think it might be better for me to stop here and do a second video, because I want to consider feminism in the context of political theory more broadly, and I think we've gone long enough here, so I'll stop here and we'll have a second video on feminism shortly.